Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today to the panel on commemorating the end of the third year of the war of Russia's war in Ukraine. When we started doing these panels a few days after Russia invaded Ukraine, speaking just for myself, I certainly didn't anticipate that this was going to become an annual ritual for us for the foreseeable future. But both Dr. Toole and I feel that it is necessary to have these panels at least once a year, in this case to take the opportunity to commemorate the 3-year anniversary since Russia invaded a neighboring sovereign country, Ukraine, but also to discuss the significance of this conflict, both for Ukraine, but increasingly for the international order as well. I'm Dr. Livschiz. I'm an associate professor of history, specializing in Russian and Soviet history and the history of the Holocaust. And I'm going to state explicitly, as per guidelines from Purdue West Lafayette, that I'm speaking for myself in my capacity as a trained historian and an expert in this field, and I am not representing the views of Purdue University.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. James Toole, associate professor of political science, and I thought I covered up my microphone. I didn't. I'm in political science. I've been here for 22 years, I think, something like that. I love teaching at Purdue Fort Wayne. My teaching and indeed my research over the years have been on both domestic politics within Eastern Europe and international relations more broadly, including, especially in recent years, the study of international human rights and international organizations. I also need to state specifically and want to state explicitly, as per guidelines from Purdue Fort Wayne, that I am indeed speaking for myself in my capacity as a trained political scientist and expert in this field. And I'm not representing the views of Purdue University.
So we have, Dr. Toole and I have an outline of topics that we would like to cover, but ultimately our goal is to also, of course, make sure that we leave time in the end for questions. Yes. And we hope to have the opportunity to answer any questions that you may have.
Good. Should we start the, would you mind? I can run it when you are speaking if you like. All right. Pausing for technical reasons.
Do you want to start and then follow?
Sure. So here's how we have decided to organize our presentations. First, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the war, and to put it into larger context, but really only for 3 or 4 minutes, because we'll talk in more detail about all of this as we go further in. After that, Dr. Livschiz will talk about the current situation within Ukraine, as well as make some comments on current social, political, economic dynamics, whatever she chooses to focus on related to the war within Russia. After which, the focus will turn to me, and I will talk about what's been going on for the past 3 years in terms of Western and other international efforts to isolate Russia and to try to hold Russia to account for its invasion of Ukraine. And then I will move on to all the things that have changed in very rapid order in just the past 3 or 4 weeks with the coming to power of Donald Trump in the U.S. and how much that has dramatically changed things. And so, in prior years, and I think Dr. Livschiz will agree with me on this, but I'm not sure, she's always looking for points of disagreement between us that she can exaggerate for dramatic effect.
But that was a legacy left to us by Dr. Downs,
It's
who
true.
always thought that if there's disagreement, it sounded better.
That's right. We can always blame Dr. Andrew Downs.
Yes.
So anyway,
I said legacy. Just to be clear, he used the word blame. I said legacy. Language matters, everyone. Language matters.
So anyway,
in the past, Dr. Livschiz has felt quite strongly, and I understood that. I sometimes disagreed, but felt quite strongly that the focus should very much be on Ukraine in these panel discussions, with also some discussion of Russia and the international and in the international dimension. However, I strongly believe at this point given current circumstances, that talking about the international dimension has now become vital because a lot is changing very quickly. So I'll be very eager to talk about the United States, about Europe, about NATO, and about very fast changing relationships there, and about the effects that might have not only on Ukraine, but also more broadly to on the security of Europe and indeed on the U.S. position in the world. So I think that's the plan. I'll go ahead with a very brief then overview of the war. And what I want to first point out is that this is the second of two wars. The first was in 2014, when in the late winter and spring of that year, Russia succeeded in taking over Crimea, as you see here, with regular Russian military forces, but also in 2014, backing separatists in eastern parts of Ukraine, who were trying to sort of annex those territories to Russia. And that's where it sort of stayed, that first map in the upper left, between 2014 and the beginning of the Second War. The Second War began 3 years ago, February 22nd of 22. And the map in the top right then shows us what the situation looked like 1 month into this current second Ukraine war. And what we see on that map, that of course is different from the two below, which are more recent, is of course we see much more pink on that top map. And the pink is areas of Russian military control. And this reminds us, and many of you remember this, I'm sure, back in February and March of 2022, Russian forces had gotten fairly deep into some parts of Ukraine, and there was quite grave concern that Russia would be able to take over much more of Ukraine than the area that it currently occupies. Then we have, by the end of 2022, this is still that same year, later in the same year of the second Russian invasion, we see Russia settling in to its military occupation of eastern Ukraine. We can see it's a much bigger swath of eastern Ukraine than Russia was able to control after the 2014 war. So this is a tremendous success for Russia compared to 2014. But we still see that, of course, the vast majority of Ukraine is free of Russian control. And I think maybe the single biggest thing to say about the rest of the war in terms of overall pattern is how incredibly similar these last two maps appear, right? And so, for at least 2.5 years, the front lines have been very, very stable. If you're fighting on the front lines, it's not stable. It's a horror. And so we have to, of course, appreciate that huge numbers of people are suffering and dying, both soldiers who are fighting this and, of course, civilians caught in the crossfire and in other ways. And we may talk a bit more about that. But in terms of the progress of the war, what's really significant is that there has effectively been a stalemate for the better part of 3 years. Although recently, Russia has clearly been able to make minor but somewhat persistent advances in the eastern part of Ukraine. So, two quick things to finish off this introductory section. First, this is, of course, a major turning point in the war as Donald Trump comes to power and really upends a lot of the international alliances and coalitions on this, and puts far more pressure on Ukraine from the U.S. than we've seen before Trump came to power. And the second thing I just want to briefly note, Dr. Livschiz may talk more about this, is of course that this has been a brutal war that has featured many mass atrocities committed by Russian and Russian-backed forces. In any war like this, there will be, of course, isolated mass atrocities on both sides, but it's overwhelmingly on the Russian side of the ledger. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, just to give us an overview, especially for those of you who may not have been following all that closely. Would you like me to go up and handle the slides? No? Okay.
Probably not.
Okay, let me know.
So there are a couple of things that I want to add to the general characterization of the war before I talk a little bit more in more detail about the Ukrainian perspective and the Russian perspective. The first, and again, and I think kind of to underscore the point that Dr. Toole made, that since definitely since February of 2022, Russia has been waging a genocidal war on the territory of Ukraine. And when I say genocidal war, I'm not using the word genocidal in that it's really bad, and so I'm trying to find a dramatic word that's very loaded in order to describe what Russia is doing. I'm using genocidal in a very specific way that incorporate, and when we look at kind of the nature of the war, what we see is Russia kind of meeting a lot of the technical definitions of genocide that have been codified in the UN Declaration in international law. The other important thing that needs to be mentioned, right, and then I think this is particularly striking when we look at these particular maps, is that when the war started, the war was supposed to last 3 days. We know this not just from the various propaganda material that was coming out of Russia at the time. There was a social media post that was automatically preset to celebrate Russia's victory that went up briefly on the internet. 3 days, when of course the war was not over. It went down, but as we know, the internet is in fact forever. And so I think that there were a lot of people who thought that, who assumed that Russia was going to be able to be victorious and Ukraine was going to lose. I am, just to make this about myself, I am happy to say that in one of our panels, I very explicitly said that there's no way that Kiev was going to fall in 3 days or any number of days. So there's a written record of me expressing my total faith in Ukrainian ability not to surrender, but certainly not to be defeated by Russia. And some of this, and again, I'll mention this now, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk more about this during the international section, but a lot of the assumptions were driven by the perception of Russia as a superpower that are based largely on Russia's view of itself as a superpower, and that are not actually backed up by a lot of things that kind of quantifiable, data or support that would make us believe that Russia is capable of defeating another country. The other important thing to note is that the war is ultimately, and I think this is especially important right now when so much of our political discourse has been reframed as, why is this war dragging on for so long? Why are Ukrainians being so stubborn about this? Why is this even happening? To kind of very strongly emphasize that the war is taking place because Putin specifically does not believe Ukraine should exist as an independent state. Putin is on record sort of expressing, considering the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, which those of you who know anything about the 20th century, I mean, that's a high bar, that's a really high bar to meet as far as tragedies of the 20th century go. And certainly kind of the continued existence of Ukraine as an independent state rather than simply as an appendage of Russia was something that was bothering Putin as he was pondering, his legacy in what many hope is the twilight of his life. And so kind of this kind of unadulterated imperialism, right, and the desire to see another country disappear is what has been driving this particular war. When we look at, and I want to start with Ukraine because I think it is really important. I think I'm so glad, obviously, that Dr. Toole provided the maps for us. But I do think it's important to make sure that kind of there are a couple of different ways that we can interpret this, right? One, for example, is to look at this and say, Russia has been trying for 3 years to conquer a country and has not been able to and has currently control over about 19% of that country. Is there a reason to view Russia as a grave threat to NATO or to any other European country, given its recent military track record? But there's another very important dimension to thinking about. Sorry, I'm moving away from Dr. Toole not because I'm disagreeing with him, but because that light is aiming right in my eyes. And I realize it may seem like I'm inching away from him, and I'm about to slightly disagree.
I'm used to it from her.
So I think behind the kind of the appearance of a stalemate, right? In addition to, of course, the kind of the hundreds of thousands of people who have been who are dead, who are injured, who have suffered in a variety of different ways. What's also hidden behind that is both the nature of the war, but also kind of a wide range of strategic innovations that we see exercised by Ukraine during this particular conflict. The war ultimately, obviously, control of the territory is very important, and certainly for the people who are living under a Russian occupation, the fact that they are under occupation is a very significant determining factor in their quality of life and in their life in general. But ultimately, modern wars are not just about the territory that you hold, and so there are these other very important dimensions. One, of course, is the attacks on the civilian population that are not under Russian occupation, and the other very important one is kind of the PR dimension of the war. The propaganda war, both of course domestically, but also for international, for international consumption. And so there are just a couple of things that I want to mention about this. The first one is that when we look at ultimately when we look at Russia's military strategy, Russian inability to actually gain more territory after its initial advances were pushed back, has really emphasized the way that Russian military strategy basically lacks military strategy and primarily relies on, to use kind of a graphic phrase that I did not make up myself, vomiting a great deal of firepower onto the civilian population in the hopes to inflict as much damage, both human damage, but also structural and infrastructure damage to Ukraine in the process. And that has been something very consistent that has been going on for the duration of the war, and something that Russia has been able to afford much more than its kind of dwindling supply of manpower. The other very important dimension is the way in which Ukraine was able to and has continued to a large extent utilize social media and various other formal and informal diplomatic channels to ensure that Ukrainian voices would be heard directly and not through a variety of intermediaries. And to go back to the point Dr. Toole made earlier, one of the reasons that I felt so strongly that we needed to center Ukraine in these conversations, in part, was out of respect for their efforts to make sure that that they are part of the conversation rather than kind of being decided, kind of being talked about or being decided on. The kind of as far as propaganda warfare goes, one of the obviously we don't have time to list all of the different innovations, but there are a couple that I want to mention. One is the really kind of the systematic way in which Ukraine has gone about collecting material and documenting evidence of atrocities and collecting material on perpetrators of those atrocities. And some of it is psychological warfare. A couple of days ago, they announced that they started releasing names of various Russian pilots who have been involved in bombing civilian targets, and it caused a tremendous amount of panic among the pilots and their families, because they release like their social media information, basically kind of everything about them. And so part of it is, of course, kind of in the moment psychological warfare, but part of it is the systematic collection of evidence of war crimes as on the assumption that the war will end, Ukraine will prevail, and Ukraine will have the opportunity to seek justice in international courts to address some of what has happened. And so it's the very powerful way in which we see this collection of material. I mean, as a historian, of course, it brings me joy, kind of purely intellectually, right? That all of this material that after other conflicts took years and years to collect is being collected in real time. And of course, there's a lot to work with, right? Because I mean, there's I'm not familiar with any instances, recognized instances of Ukraine committing any war crimes. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I'm not familiar with any. But certainly we have an overwhelming record of atrocities, both against the civilian population, the bombing of cities, the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of kindergartens, kind of the strategic efforts to bomb, shopping malls during the day and apartment complexes at night in order to make sure that you're maximizing, maximizing your casualties, and of course, the gruesome records of executions of unarmed Ukrainian PFWs, right, that are being recorded in a celebratory, essentially, again, examples of war crimes that are being recorded and posted on social media in quite celebratory ways. And so I think it took a lot of people by surprise to see how well Ukraine was able to use social media and propaganda, because the assumption was that Russia was going to have the edge in the propaganda, the propaganda field of the war. The other very important thing to mention about Ukrainian innovations is their use of technology, their use of drones, right? One of the big debates that we see in Ukraine is that while overall morale is certainly high, and ironically, the recent developments have actually increased, have been a huge boon to Zelensky's, popularity and, and approval. Ultimately, this is a war that is that is traumatic, that is draining, and that is debilitating to Ukraine. And there are a lot of discussions and debates about how should conscription run, what age groups should be subject to conscription, because Ukraine and Zelensky and other politicians have been very explicit about the fact that they are not just thinking about how to win the war right now, but also thinking about the future of Ukraine. If a cohort of people is killed off in defending Ukraine, what is left, what will be left in order for Ukraine, to be able to, continue. And so that that important dimension has placed a lot more emphasis on technological innovation as a way to try to to compensate for the unwillingness of Ukraine to dump unlimited human beings into the conflict, in very dramatic contrast, of course, to what we see happening. To what we see happening in Russia. Other fascinating innovations, at one point, one of the things that we saw happen, of course, Ukraine taking, entering Russian territory, not necessarily because they think that they are going to conquer Russia, but psychologically, the fact that the war has, at least in one area, has shifted from Ukrainian territory to Russian territory. And there's fascinating stuff on social media, including the discovery by many people in Russia that they understand Ukrainian, and maybe, just maybe, should this region be part of Russia? Should this region be part of Ukraine? Some humorous, some perhaps less so. So I think that's those are the main, and obviously, again, during questions, I'm happy to answer more questions, but I want to make sure that we get through all the materials, all the materials that we have. And so I think that that's the big point that I wanted to make, about Ukraine.
Good.
Did you want to say anything about Ukraine?
I'll just say one thing, and that is to give a little context to what I said about mass atrocities. So the reason I said that, basically in any modern war, there tend to be individual acts of mass atrocity crimes committed on both sides. And I always just make that point. As I said earlier, overwhelmingly on the Russian side. But here's, to give a little more context, I don't see any evidence that the Ukrainian state has any official policies are supporting any such behavior. However, since the Nuremberg tribunals and the Tokyo tribunals after World War II, we're now in a world where individuals have criminal responsibility under international law for committing mass atrocity crimes. So, in any war on both sides, there are at least occasional examples of individual people or individual units who go beyond sanctioned state policy and commit these. So just to give a little context for why I said that. But no, please go ahead. I'll save my other comments for the international stuff.
But just to be clear, it's interesting that of all the different things that Russia has been using as propaganda fodder, it has not been able to find examples of real Ukrainian atrocities that have been committed, because such events, whether perpetrated by individuals or not, would make for great propaganda, of course, and we have not seen Russian propaganda do that. So the other, my other responsibility is to talk about Russian military strategies, and I already gave you kind of a glimpse into Russian military, military strategy. So there are a couple of main points, right? The first one is willingness to sacrifice huge number of people, both Russian people, let me rephrase, both people who live in Russia, but also people from other countries who may have been, let's say, donated for the Russian war effort. Most recently, of course, military people from North Korea. And it is important to know that that is a feature of both Imperial Russian and Soviet military strategy, the reliance on the assumption that Russia is a big country, Soviet Union is a big country, it has a large population, and it has an indefinite supply of people who can be conscripted into service. Of course, parenthetically, it should be noted that that assumption has served the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Russia reasonably well over the years, but ultimately Russian population is actually declining. The war is certainly not helping with that in any way. So it's not necessarily a sustainable, military, military strategy. It should also be noted that there was a lot of excitement when it was discovered that North Korean troops were being utilized by on the Russian side in the war against Ukraine, and there was a fair amount of hand-wringing about this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, what this means for NATO and all of these other and all of these other kinds of things. But it should be noted that ultimately they're pretty much done, and they're done for a number of reasons, including the fact that North Korea feels that Russian misabuse of troops is too much, right? So the kind of the bar for how many people are you willing to sacrifice for whatever cause, that line has been crossed by Russia for North Korea now, although apparently not for Russia, kind of Russia itself. The other, of course, is the reliance on prisoners who are being offered the opportunity to go serve in the military as a way to get early release. Most recently, Russia has been relying a lot on people who are being enticed with financial incentives as a way to go and fight. And actually, oh my God, sorry guys. There's a really great. I know it's very dramatic. Trust me, it's totally worth it. I promise. I'm scrolling.
The camera also just went off. Oh, you did, I see, because you're scrolling through, yeah.
Okay, I'm scrolling through atrocity porn. It's a page. Oh, there it is. Oh, that's the one I wanted. This. The way that kind of the who is actually who is serving in the Russian military, and this is an important point for a number of reasons. Says a lot about the Russian military, but it's also I wanted to show this also as a way to make sure that we don't continue to treat this war as Putin's war, right? People are willing to go kill Ukrainians because this is a way that they feel that they can make the most amount of money. Again, it's partially a testimony to the structural problems of the Russian economy, but again, the willingness to go fight and do horrific things as a way to get a down payment on the car by so many people is an indication of the kind of support for the war and the kind of support for Putin's policies. Policies more generally. Other things that need to be mentioned as far as the war is concerned, right? I mean, again, thinking about the various atrocities, the torture chambers, right? The destruction of civilian population, the destruction of dams that lead to not just human death, but tremendous ecological damage. Over 90,000 cases of rape and sexual abuse by Russian soldiers. Most victims are elderly, a lot of the victims are elderly women and young children, and captured Russian soldiers say that they target them because they don't run as fast. And so I think all of these are really, really important dimensions of kind of the Russian war. And ultimately, right, I mean, this is part of the strategy to break the spirit of Ukraine, to terrorize the Ukrainian population into not fighting, into not fighting anymore. And so to go back to this question of, why is Ukraine fighting? Ukraine is fighting to remain an independent country because on the territories of Ukraine that were under occupation, that were liberated by the Ukrainian military, those territories became sites of exhumation of mass graves and the discovery of horrific atrocities that took place. And so kind of it's pretty clear, right, that is in fact what is going to happen in territories that are under Russian occupation if Russia is able to advance into other territories of Ukraine. In addition to the destruction of human beings, I should also mention destruction of churches, destruction of Bibles, specifically Bibles published in Ukrainian, the burning of books published in Ukrainian, the bombing of publishing houses that publish in Ukrainian, the killing of journalists and other, and other cultural figures, all of, and last but certainly not least, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, bringing them to Russia, changing their names, and allowing them to be adopted by Russian families, which is literally one of the definitions of genocide, according to the classic Lemkin UN definition. So I think maybe I'll stop here. Sorry, I'll stop here, and let's talk about the international dimension.
Let's do it. All right, so I'm going to organize this into two sections. First, I want to talk about what was happening before President Trump came into office. I think it's particularly important to remember this now because the contrasts are so sudden and so great in the past month. So let's do that. Remind ourselves of what was going on. So first I'm going to talk about the strength of the Western and more broadly international response against Russia. And then I'm going to talk about some ways in which it was weaker than that. And then we'll move into the Trump era. Okay, so first, the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unexpectedly strong and unified. There were weaknesses, I'll talk about them, but it was extraordinary. I don't think anyone anticipated that the response would be as strong as it was. Massive economic sanctions levied against Russia by the United States, the European Union, and individual European states, as well as other states from around the world, had a tremendous effect on the Russian economy. Now, later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Russia actually handled those effects better than one might expect. But the all-encompassing nature and severity of these sanctions was really, truly extraordinary. And by the way, this was at considerable cost, particularly to European countries like Germany, which previously had relied quite heavily on imports of natural gas and other important resources from Russia. So, especially European countries were making some real sacrifices to make this happen. So that's the first thing, the extraordinary sanctions. Before I move on, I do want to point out that this unexpectedly strong and unified response was, of course, in response to aggression by Russia against the sovereignty of another UN member state. And there is no law more fundamental in international law in the 21st century than this one, with the exclusion of mass atrocity, crimes on mass atrocity laws on mass atrocity crimes. So in short, when we look at international laws, the two biggest ones are don't commit mass atrocities and do not invade another sovereign country. And so I can't emphasize enough how blatant and egregious a violation of international law Russia's invasion of Ukraine was before we even get into the manner of the invasion and the occupation and the mass atrocity crimes that Dr. Livschiz so accurately talked about. Second element of this unexpectedly strong and unified response was military support from the US and Europe. Would you mind bringing up that slide?
Yep.
Appreciate it. So military support from the United States and Europe. And we see here.
It will take a second to see it.
Yeah, in terms of actual military supplies sent to Ukraine, as well as money given to Ukraine for the purchase of military supplies, really an extraordinary effort on the part of both Europe and the United States, and I think it's coming up right now. So we have a comparison. And here I'm kind of in the way of some of this data, so I'll step aside for a moment. You can see this is the whole extent of the war, basically, from from a couple weeks before the war through the end of 2024. And we see that we're talking about a lot of money. This is in euros, billions of euros. But it's worth noting that the euro dollar exchange rate right now is 1.05 to 1. And throughout this whole period, a euro and a dollar have been just about the same. So we could just think of this in dollar terms. So we see European countries and EU institutions collectively, this is cumulatively, have given maybe about 130 billion, a lot of money, 130 billion euros in military, financial, and humanitarian assistance. The United States not too far behind, at something over 100, probably about 110 billion euros. And so that's what's been given so far over the past 3 years. We'll come back to that $100 billion dollar figure a bit later when we talk about the claim made by President Trump. Aid yet to be allocated, we can see that it's now gone down to almost nothing for the U.S. and but Europe continues to pledge money to the effort. If we move on to the next one, we just see basically similar data in a different form. Again, we see European and EU countries and U.S. getting to be roughly parallel over the 3 years. Again, culminating at a little over 100 billion U.S. dollars in all forms of support. Great. So really quite extraordinary. Also, when speaking about the military, we should bring in NATO. NATO is clearly strengthened by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is actually pretty stunning and contrary to one of Vladimir Putin's clearly stated top goals for this war. He wanted to weaken Western resolve. He wanted to divide NATO. It's very clear. He said it himself. This is what he wanted to do. He utterly and completely failed until Donald Trump came into office. We'll talk about that again, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Utterly and completely failed. In fact, NATO expanded by 2 members, Finland and Sweden, who were never going to join NATO were it not for what they now perceived as a new and very serious military threat facing their region. Let me move on briefly to then some weaknesses of this otherwise quite strong and unified response. Number one, the Russian economy proved resilient in more ways than people expected. Still, a significant, I think, long-term economic hit, but Russia did succeed in dramatically shifting trade away from Europe and the West to other parts of the world, including most notably China, India, etc. So the effect was not as damaging as some had thought of the effect, that is, of the sanctions, but still considerable effect. There also were some divisions in the West over strategy and over the absorption of Ukrainian refugees. And actually, Anne, if you don't mind, since you're on that side of the table, if that's all right, I have one more slide in this section, and that is on refugees. So we see, okay, the contrast isn't great there, but we see here I've added some data on the left-hand side. Pre-war population of Ukraine, about 36 million people. Ukrainian refugees abroad, that's as of this very month, add up to almost 7 million, so 19% of the total population of Ukraine. That does not, of course, include internally displaced people within Ukraine, or, of course, Ukrainians caught behind Russian lines and now in Russian-occupied territory. So the fact that you see 20%, almost 20% of the Ukrainian population abroad, because to be a refugee, you have to be abroad, that's part of the definition, is really quite extraordinary. We see circles representing the number of Ukrainian refugees taken in. We see Poland and Germany with very large circles there, absorbing a quite exceptional number of people from Ukraine. Almost all Ukrainian refugees are somewhere in Europe right now. So, but there, of course, were some big disagreements over this. I was just going to say there are countries with very, very tiny dots or almost no dots, or almost no circles, because there was, of course, there were some countries that were much more generous and some countries that were much less generous for refugees. And the final sort of weakness in this era of otherwise quite unified Western and international opposition to Russia concerns international organizations where there was really a mixed response. The UN General Assembly has passed some important resolutions condemning the invasion, including one just very recently in the last several days. But nothing at all has happened, of course, in the UN Security Council. And that, of course, is because the structure of the Security Council, Russia having one of the 5 vetoes on the council, ensures that the council will never make any decision that goes against its interests. It is surprising that the International Criminal Court, an otherwise pretty weak international organization, has indeed indicted Vladimir Putin. This was in March of 2023 on some very specific war crimes charges, and those have to do with the deportation and transfer of children in time of war, which is a war, this is a war crimes indictment, not a genocide indictment. Let me move on to my second subject, and that is what has happened since Donald Trump came into office. Yes.
We found the point of disagreement. So
we weren't looking for one.
And yet there it is. So I think when we initially started doing these panels, right when the war started, we were in total agreement on this particular issue, on the surprised strength and unity of the West in this particular situation. And I think it was particularly striking because it's precisely the lack of unity that was one of the things that Putin was counting on, because in all the previous examples, both towards Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, right? If we look at Russia's behavior towards many of its neighbors pre-2014, not just Ukraine, there are plenty of examples of acts of aggression that the West chose not to view that way, chose to see as ethnic strife or just not see it at all. And that is something that has contributed to Putin's sense of invincibility and the ability to get away with whatever he wanted, because he did in fact get away with whatever he wanted up until that point. But the part where I disagree with Dr. Toole is that I think that behind the facade of unity, I do think that there are some very important ways in which the international community, international organizations were not quite as strong on Russia, did not enforce sanctions quite as well as they arguably should have, which provided a wide range of loopholes. I think that the first part is that I think part of why Russia was able to withstand the economic pressures better than anticipated was because he was able to evade those sanctions in a variety of different ways. It stole grain from Ukraine and sold it, transporting it in ships that were not identified as Russian ships and therefore not subject to sanctions. There was all sorts of things going on with oil and gas. But the other area in which I think Russia benefited even more than in the economic area, it's in the ways in which the international community always felt that they couldn't be too harsh on Russia, right? There's this kind of ideological position that stems from, I don't know, Dr. Bauer's here, maybe she'll correct me, that goes back to sort of the 18th, 19th century conception of great powers and balance of powers, and how certain countries just have to exist and they have to be strong as a way, because that's just how the world is. And so a lot of the conversations from the beginning were always about, how do we let Russia get out of this in a way that leaves Russia intact? How do we let Russia get out of this in a way that allows Putin to save his honor, save face, whatever the case may be? How do we make sure that his feelings aren't too hurt in this particular process? And this preoccupation with Putin and his feelings, and the desire not to hurt Russia too much, not to embarrass Russia too much.
About his feelings, except as a strategic or tactical.
And that's fine, right? But I think even rhetorically, the fact that people say that, there's not the same attention to the feelings of Zelensky or the feelings of Ukrainians. And I think that this fundamental, when we look back, especially when we talk about the most recent phase, when we look back and we see the different opportunities that existed, the lack of willingness to do something definitive to Russia is a fundamental component of Western policy towards Russia. I know we've disagreed on this, but I'm going to stand firm on this. This is something that, and we are dealing with the consequences of this constantly because of Russia's behavior, not just in Ukraine, but in many other places around the world. And I think that the constant need to make sure we hear the Russian perspective, the constant need to normalize Russia, the constant need to differentiate between Putin's war versus the Russian people, the need to make sure that Russian, athletes from Russia are able to participate in international competitions, right? Ukrainian athletes are literally dead and they can't participate, but we can't take away the opportunity from Russian athletes. I mean, not everything is about NATO or UN, but this is an important part of the international community, and we see this in every area.
I hear you. I want to make sure I have time to talk about
yes, right. And so that's all I'll say for now, and then we'll have.
I do want to respond. I agree in all the details. I strongly disagree in the overall argument. I agree with you on every single detail, but here's the difference. This was absolutely extraordinary, and the reason and I don't think we can find another instance this strong. And you're right, there are weaknesses all over, but the weaknesses are because the international legal and political system is inherently and deeply weak. We could not expect any more than this. It's extraordinary there was this level of agreement and unity. So it's vital to put this into broad perspective. And so, yeah, it is shot through with problems, absolutely. But it's still more extraordinary, a more extraordinary degree of unity than we have ever seen on any major issue like this from the West. That remains true despite all of the things, and I agree with you on all those details.
It can be extraordinary and still pathetic.
It can be. Well, there you go. It's extraordinary and sad. Absolutely. And it's sad. It's sad if you want there to be a world in which problems like these can be handled much more fairly and justly. But the world isn't structured that way in many respects. I'm going to move on, but I think we agree to disagree on that one. So Donald Trump, many of you have heard, Donald Trump is our new president. So a lot has changed. A lot has changed. So first, a stark reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, not only toward Russia, but toward all sorts of things. I would argue it's a stark repudiation of post-1945 United States foreign policy all around the world in all sorts of ways. Let's begin with reversing the 3-year Western strategy to isolate Russia. Donald Trump, of course, went ahead and had a 90-minute phone call with Vladimir Putin after years of leaders agreeing to not even talk with him. And just last week, we saw a high-level foreign minister-level meeting between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia that completely excluded Ukraine or any of the U.S.'s European allies. Number two, in the stark repudiation of U.S. foreign policy, pressuring an ally in its time of dire need is extraordinary. I don't think we can find another example of this. Although we do find, I think, a more mild example of this in the first Trump term when he put enormous pressure on South Korea to renegotiate a trade agreement when North Korea was acting in its most aggressive phase. But this is far more dramatic. So the U.S., of course, is demanding repayment of the military aid that it has given to Ukraine via rare earth minerals investment plan. And as you well know, if you're following the news just in the last day or two, the details are not clear. I'm not sure the details are even clear behind the scenes, but there's a lot of reporting. It looks like Ukraine is willing to sign some version of this document, and Zelensky's flying to Washington Friday to presumably sign this. Who knows what's going to happen, but this is extraordinary, and we don't see other examples of this kind of thing. The U.S. basically saying to a friend and ally, Ukraine, in a time of dire need, that we might help you, although we won't make any promises whatsoever, but we might help you if you turn over some significant share of valuable natural resources. Number three, reversing decades-old alliance policies and politics at the UN Security Council. The resolution on Monday was truly extraordinary in the UN Security Council, where the US got a resolution passed with the support of Russia and China, and with its two closest allies in the Council, Britain and France, abstaining. And this was a resolution calling for an end to the war, but refusing to blame Russia for aggression or even mention aggression, and refusing to acknowledge Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. It's hard to express what a shocking departure that is from U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II. You can't make it stronger than that. It's so strong, in fact, that some Republican senators have spoken out against it. So really quite shocking. Also in the UN General Assembly, which doesn't have the legally binding power that the UN Security Council has, but still, there was a Ukrainian resolution put forth by Ukraine that passed overwhelmingly in the General Assembly that the US actually voted against, that it voted against Ukraine, siding with some of the most brutal authoritarian regimes on planet Earth, by the way. In that was just stunning. And yeah, the UN is weak. The UN doesn't have that much influence, et cetera, et cetera. But symbolically, this is really quite extraordinary, and says a lot about President Trump's attitude toward the international legal order. But more than that, because that's not too surprising, the utter dismissal of long-held Western alliance commitments and alliance loyalty. Another thing we can say about this stark reorientation, the attempt to rewrite history, with Donald Trump saying last week that Ukraine shouldn't have started the war, which is a simply truly preposterous statement, because it's very obvious that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, of course, we can look back at the past history and have additional context about grievances between Russia and the West, but nothing justifies the invasion of a sovereign country under international law. And one country invaded another, the other did not invade itself. So I have more to say. I won't go into that. And just the sidelining of European allies of the US is just absolutely stunning. And by the way, this is part of a bigger picture as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to spend about just a few more minutes finishing up here by talking about the broader implications, not so much for Ukraine now, maybe in part, but also for the US, Europe, et cetera. So Ukraine, number one, is in a terrible, terrible position, just a terrible position now, with the US effectively dramatically withdrawing support and shifting sides, European countries just scrambling to figure out what they can do, if anything. Number two, NATO is clearly on life support now. This is the military alliance that we have depended upon since 1945. The strongest military alliance the world has ever seen in most respects. And it's deeply uncertain now whether the US would come to the aid of any other NATO member who is attacked. That is the foundation of NATO. If any one country is attacked, all the others come to its aid. And that promise of collective security is what is, I think, largely what has prevented outside countries from attacking any NATO members, because you attack one NATO member, you've got to fight them all. And now I think no one knows whether the US would have any commitment to that. Moreover, more reason to doubt that is that the US actually did say it would not rule out, President Trump said he would not rule out military invasion of Greenland. Now, I very much doubt that that's ever going to happen, but let's just look at the broad perspective here. Greenland, of course, is an autonomous territory, but it is within the Kingdom of Denmark. And so that was actually Donald Trump saying he would not rule out military action against a fellow NATO ally. So not only are we talking about maybe not coming to the aid of a NATO ally who's attacked, also, at least, maybe jokingly, but I'm not, maybe probably jokingly, the US toying with the idea of possibly using military force against its own ally, which raises the question whether in 2 or 4 years the US, I guess we should say 4 years, the US, how many friends will we have in the world? Like true friends will we have in the world? And yes, we're really powerful. We may be able to get away with not having many friends, but these friendships are deep and they go back so long and they bring tremendous benefits. And right now it feels like they're being thrown out the window in a matter of days. I went to a talk back in 2010 at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, given by Wang Jishu, who is a leading Chinese international relations scholar, and he said, and keep in mind this is before the rise of Xi Jinping and when Chinese scholars were a bit freer to speak openly. But he said to this gathering in Chicago, to all of us, he said, you know, one of the great strength the US has is its allies. And he said, look, I'm a Chinese patriot. I want China to grow. I want China to become more powerful. I think China and the US are going to have some serious problems ahead. But he said, the big problem we have is we don't have true friends. And you do. And that is just an enormous well of support. And it always has been. And we're throwing all this away. And then finally, I'll just wrap up. European security is in serious danger, I think, beyond Ukraine now, especially if the promise of NATO no longer holds. I can tell you, if you lived in the Baltic states right now, you'd be pretty concerned. And the last thing is that the U.S. position, the U.S. shift, the abrupt shift from Ukraine to Russia, to the point where the administration won't even say that Russia started the war, strengthens a precedent that great powers should be able to invade other countries when they want to. So, and let's put this into broader perspective, considering what the US has said about Greenland, right? Considering what Donald Trump has said about Panama, considering what he said about Gaza.
Canada.
I'm not done. No,
Okay.
I'm teasing. And
Don't forget Canada.
No, I was going there.
Sorry.
And Canada, right? And again, some of these, there's no way Canada's going to become part of the United States. But still, the point is, it will. I'm on record. I'll go on record there. But still, mainly because Republicans wouldn't win another election for a very long time. But anyway, my point is, here's the point. It's my big wrap up. So then we'll go to questions and answers. Right? So, but anyway, is that of course this kind of talk and this kind of behavior from the U.S. legitimizes Russian aggression in Ukraine and legitimizes Chinese claims over Taiwan. And so if we were worried about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan before, we should be more worried about it now, because we no longer have any moral or legal authority to be complaining about that after suddenly shifting our loyalty from a country that had been invaded to the invader. Yes.
I did want to add a couple of things. I think that obviously I don't want to underestimate how grave Ukraine's situation is at the moment, but I will say that I think certainly, and I referenced this earlier, the recent attacks have resulted in a huge increase in Zelensky's approval ratings. There is politicians from a variety of political parties have explicitly said that they wouldn't vote, they didn't vote for Zelensky, they won't vote for Zelensky next time there are elections, but they support him and his position. So I think in some ways, this external attack has helped kind of solidify support for the war. Europe, I think I totally agree with Dr. Toole. Europe definitely is scrambling, but there are also some potentially really interesting opportunities that may raise questions about America's future power, not just in terms of international institutions, but economically as well. There is an alternative to Starlink, for example, that has been developed. It's not quite as fast, but you know what? Maybe it's better rather than being beholden to Musk. There have been discussions about increase in nuclear weapons. Just this morning, I saw that France offered. 21st century is a ride for a historian. France offered to let Germany have some nuclear weapons, and Britain said that if France does it, Britain will totally do it as well. So it's not like a tomorrow thing, but definitely some very interesting developments as Europe is figuring out how to make arrangements, right, in the kind of in the void of the United States.
Can I just say on that point, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Britain, who comes to Washington tomorrow to meet with President Trump, he's already announced he's going to slash Britain's humanitarian aid budget, his foreign aid budget, in order to increase defense spending. Not because Trump is pressuring them to increase defense spending, but rather the other reason, because Europeans are thinking, oh my God, we have to take care of ourselves now.
Absolutely. And as far as our current shift in foreign policy, I just want to say a couple of very quick things. The first one is, honestly, in not even the wildest dreams of any Soviet or post-Soviet leader could have imagined what has taken place in the last, well, 8 years, but especially the last couple of months. Certainly, I mean, one can make the argument that Russia is getting exactly what it paid for, and it made a good investment at one point in time. But it's really, really dramatic. The other one, kind of echoing back the earlier comment I made about Russian propaganda. Initially, at the beginning of the war, Russian propaganda efforts that everybody assumed were all powerful were diminished for a variety of ways. Russian propaganda has made a huge comeback, and one of the ways that Russia has made a huge comeback is that at this point in time, the Trump administration is literally parroting Russian talking points, contemporary ones and ones from the past. So we've reached a point that our government is now an engine for Russian propaganda rather than simply a consumer, of Russian propaganda. And these are all obviously kind of very dramatic things that have implications. I can't believe I'm the one who's going to say it, not just for American foreign policy, but for American domestic situation as well, though that is obviously not the subject of our conversation. So we do actually have time for questions.
Yeah, let's go to questions.
Deanna?
Yeah, I have one question for each one of you. The first one to Dr. Livschiz. How is the Russian media portraying the relationship between Putin and Trump? And how are they kind of giving, I guess, some kind of legitimation to this idea that maybe Russia is ascendant, in this particular relationship? And then for Dr. Toole, the idea that America is strong enough because of its allies is like international mythology, because Czech Radio has been saying that too. But I noticed that both the German and the Polish leaders on Monday were coming out very strongly against, the American actions. But how much does that filter into both Russian and Polish kind of domestic politics? Is there kind of a deep well, of kind of support against Russia, or are there different elements within those two publics that might be more amenable to stopping the war on Russia's terms more than on Ukraine's?
Did you want to go first?
No.
Well, the Russian media could not be happier. And I mean, they've been happy for a while. They've been very but they're downright giddy. Every time that since the election, but especially since the announcement, for example, of various cabinet picks, and then their confirmation, Russia is very explicit in naming names and talking about the fact that they pretty much they're owned by Russia. There was a recent article that explicitly said that Trump. It's sort of vague, but it's basically something to the effect of Trump was helped to come to power by certain forces, and those forces expect to be paid back in return. And obviously, there's always a possibility, right, that this is that kind of Russia celebrating this is part of propaganda. It doesn't have to be just because Russian propaganda says something doesn't necessarily make it true, but there's certainly sufficient other evidence that suggests that that's, again, whether willfully or not, the current administration is doing Russia's bidding internationally, whether they're doing it for money, whether they're doing it for ideological reasons, whether they're doing it by accident. At a certain point it stops being relevant, right? What matters is actions, and those actions are very, very very clear.
And that's a great question, but I'll be honest with you, I haven't had any time in the last couple of weeks when all this has happened to look at Polish or Czech public opinion on this. I will just say, for the benefit of everyone else, because I know you know this really, really well, is that, of course, the Polish public has long had deep skepticism and antipathy toward Russia, going back centuries to that period between 1795 and 1919 or so, when it didn't even exist as a country because it was, dismembered by Russia, among others. And also deep loyalty to the U.S. Poland's been one of our strongest allies since the end of the Cold War, in part because of the strong sort of ethnic Polish population in the United States, but but for other reasons as well. Again, you know the answer, you know all that, but I'm just for the benefit of everyone else.
Germany, not the Czech
Oh,
Republic.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were talking about Poland and the Czech Republic.
Oh, sorry, I said Poland and Germany because I noticed that the Germans.
Well, I mean, so again, great. I mean, there's just great disillusionment all across Europe toward the United States, right? One noteworthy thing concerning Germany, of course, is that in the election this past weekend that brought the Christian Democrats back to power in Germany, it looks very clear that sort of last-minute statements by Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, et cetera, did not have the desired effect of moving more Germans to the right to support the Alternative for Deutschland party. So the AfD did better than it ever has in the past, but it didn't do quite as well as expected, and there was no bump, after those comments. So I think that the general sense among most people in Germany and more broadly in Europe is this sense of panic about not only kind of losing a good friend in the United States, but possibly having in the U.S. some form of adversarial relationship. Other questions?
Dr. Schuster?
I have a question. How are people in Europe and Russia portraying this kind of a devolution of the federal government, purging of the military? How is it being portrayed abroad? Is it portrayed as a side story, or is it being portrayed as America's going through some really fundamental shifts here in terms of our relationship with our federal government and the military being recrafted in a more of a Trumpian face?
Well, I would just say that all of this is happening so fast.
Yeah.
Not that we didn't know, not that we shouldn't have known this was coming. I mean, I think we should have known and should fully have expected that a second Trump term would be much more vigorous and aggressive policy-wise than the first term was. I think everyone should have known that, but I think many, many people did not recognize that would happen. So I think people are in just a state of a swirl of just kind of trying to figure out what's going on. But one thing is true, all around the world, many more people follow American politics more closely than Americans follow politics of any other country in the world. So there's always been that interest in domestic American politics. So my guess would be that many people are following the domestic side of this in the U.S. Much more closely than before. I guess I'll just leave it there. I don't really know, David, that I can identify any particular trends apart from just, what I've said already, this generalized panic among our allies. I suppose if you look at public opinion in other countries that don't like the U.S. too much, it'd be different. But I haven't had a chance. I mean, everything's happening so quickly, right?
I think in general in Russia, I think there's glee. I mean, that's the thing. The thing about Russian propaganda, and I would draw a contrast. I mean, during the Soviet period, Soviet propaganda wanted to undermine the United States, but there was a constructive element to it, right? The idea was that they wanted to undermine the United States on the assumption that the U.S. was undermined, then a political system similar to the Soviet Union would come into place, and of course it was a superior system, and we'd have an ally, and they would have an ally, and so on. What's different about post-Soviet propaganda is that there's no constructive dimension to it anymore, right? It's not we need to destroy what they have so they can become more like us. It's literally just we just need to destroy, right? Everything is geared towards undermining, right? I mean, of course, the irony is that it utilizes Western institutions like the technology, social media technology, and various freedoms as a tool to undermine and destroy Western institutions, right? Kind of our obsession with both sidism, right? If you dump enough stuff on one side, on one side of the spectrum, it shifts both sides, right? It shifts the consensus in a particular direction, for example, right? So these kinds of disinformation dumps essentially help shift public opinion. So in that sense, what's happening right now fills our enemies with great joy, precisely because everything that is happening is sheer chaos and destruction, and of course, and this is obviously very unflattering. For us, it underscores the weakness of our institutions, right? We're so proud of our institutions and all of these other kinds of things. And everything is falling apart and everything is folding, at least it appears to be falling apart and folding very quickly. So certainly as far as projecting an image of a powerful country to the rest of the world, especially countries like China. I'm not going to put Russia in a category of powerful countries, but certainly for China, watching United States sort of disintegrate, right, and our institutions like the military being destroyed is certainly cause for celebration, right? I mean, rather than anything else.
Is a strong word. But
Yeah,
things are being recrafted.
I'm sorry,
I was going to say, I think saying our military is being destroyed is, so.
I said what I said.
We may disagree on this, but one thing I would point out here just briefly, and I want to go to questions, is, I doubt very much that the Trump administration can keep up this degree of energy over a full 4 years. So, a lot has happened last month. I'm assuming the pace is going to slow at some point. It has to. It will. It absolutely will. And our institutions may prove somewhat resilient, although I know, but I'm just saying. So I think it is important to keep this in perspective. I don't think the U.S. military is being destroyed at all. But our institutions are being weakened right now, and they're being strongly tested in a way they haven't been in a very long time. So we can disagree, I think, on that.
The destruction of the JAG Corps is
Look, I'm not saying it's not
I don't know. That to me, that goes beyond damaging. Stop destroying people
well,
who
we'll
can
disagree.
potentially stop bad things from happening.
I know.
Seems like a destruction. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Rowan. So, anyone can answer. Can Ukraine hang in for the next 4 years? Because we have Trump taking sides, leaning more towards Russia, not even leaning. He's in bed with them. But looking at after 4 years, fingers crossed. Can the Ukraine hang in there for 4 years to see what happens after Trump is hopefully gone? And then what does the post 4 years look like? So what does that future look like after the 4 years? And then I do have a second question once that's answered.
I have a quick question to that. I don't think we're going to have this panel discussion next year. I don't think there's going to be a 4th year war in Ukraine panel discussion, because I think there is going to be a resolution to this, and it's going to be fairly soon, whether we like it or not. And I'll go on record for that. So next
That's
year
fine.
at the panel discussion, I just said we won't have. Dr. Livschiz can crow about how wrong I was, but
I would never
what I would
crow.
say is you asked whether will there be a, I'm not sure how you put it, but I do want to make clear, I think there will be a Ukraine. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, that there will be a Ukraine, but I think the war will have been stopped in some way, even if it's a deeply dissatisfying outcome to people who support Ukraine.
I think that if we define war, it depends on how we define war,
yeah, of course.
right?
I'm talking about actual battlefield combat.
Right. The people of Ukraine are not going to just. There was a great when Ukraine agreed to this mineral deal, which is completely devoid of anything, right? I mean, it's a symbolic gesture that no longer has any guarantees on either side, right? So it's a way to placate Trump.
It's not symbolic to make a lot of money for the United
Right,
States.
potentially, but it's very vague about how any of that money is actually going to be made. Trump said, now Ukraine has a right to fight on. Ukraine had a response to that, and that is that they don't need Trump's permission to fight on. And so I think that it is possible that Zelensky may be forced into something, but keep in mind that Ukraine is a democracy. There are multiple political parties in play, and the vast majority of those political parties are not going to, including ones that disagree with Zelensky, have no interest in surrendering to Russia in any kind of capacity. So even if it's possible that Zelensky is personally forced into something, which I don't believe will happen, but it could, anything, 2025 shows that truly anything is possible. There's going to continue to be resistance, and there's going to continue to be resistance until all territories, for Ukraine, it will not be over until all of Ukrainian territories are no longer under Russian occupation. Whether that will formally be a war or whether that will be kind of just, partisan warfare and that kind of resistance. But I also think that an argument against an agreement, I think it would set a really bad precedent, and I'm not sure that I think the Europeans might dig deep and find in some spinal fortitude
Wow. Really?
I know, yeah, that's what Look, I found an ounce of optimism. I don't
You
feel.
were so discouraged at the international system not providing
I think they're
wonderful
scared.
results.
Oh, because they're scared shitless right now. So to use a technical term, and so I think that there's a realization that U.S. cannot be counted on, and so as a result, I do think that either Europe has to accept that I guess nothing matters, or they're going to actually have to do something for real and not like what they've been doing for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And then my last question is, unless I misunderstood the map that you had showing the refugees from Ukraine going to different countries, I noticed that Russia had a very large circle. And I may have misunderstood, but are those people willingly going to Russia?
So what's interesting about these are UNHCR data. So generally I have great respect for UNHCR data, but in that I don't necessarily trust that, and I don't know how Russia's reporting it, and I don't. So I don't. That is not representing a number of Ukrainians willingly going to Russia to take refuge. There's probably virtually zero in that category.
Well, it's people from Ukraine, right?
Right,
So there there were ethnic
But-
Russians who may have,
right.
so when
That's
the
what
war
that's what I'm
started
saying.
felt that it was safe, who were citizens
Right.
of Ukraine, who felt that it was better or safer for them to be in Russia, who had family there, or they were promised certain things, or they were moved,
Forcibly
or they were
deported.
not given the
We
choice.
should not put them in that
Right.
bubble, but my guess is that data is very bad and
Right.
confusing.
But there are some people who did go willingly
course. Oh,
based
yeah.
on
Right.
information available to them and their
But
their
very
priorities.
Smart question, because that one circle is the one we can have no faith in.
Got a question? I don't know if you guys have seen anything, but there were a couple articles published by The Guardian, I think one in 2018, one in 2023, about the rumor, maybe, it's a published article, so they can't just publish it with no facts, but that Donald Trump was recruited as a Russian asset by the KGB back in 1987. There was some evidence of money laundering through real estate projects that were never started, all kinds of stuff like that. Even just today, I think he announced the gold card for rich immigrants who want to come over, and he said, there's a lot of great Russian oligarchs who are friendly. I guess my main question is, at what point, given his behavior, is he allowed to be tried for treason? And if he does get to that point, what's that going to look like, the fallout in the U.S. if that was to happen?
Well, it's a good question. There's no evidence that, really of this. I don't think, but yeah,
I'm sorry, there is.
no, I know, but all right, I still put this in the realm of conspiracy theory. We can talk about evidence, but there's lots of apparent evidence about all sorts of things circulating around the world these days. So in my mind, I guess I don't even think that it matters so much. It does matter. If you were recruited as a Russian agent, it would matter. Absolutely would matter. I'm skeptical about that. So because I'm skeptical, I just say look at the actions and behavior and be critical of that. But you're right. If you're just looking at actions and behavior, then a charge of treason, would not be. I don't think there is not going to be a treason trial for Donald Trump. I would predict that very confidently now, regardless of how any of us may feel. That's my confident prediction.
I'll agree with that.
He hasn't even been able to be impeached.
He was already being impeached, but he was impeached.
No,
Conversation with Zelensky. So.
No, I understand, but not right. Yes.
I think that I wouldn't I wouldn't publish an article saying I believe he is an agent, but I think that there's a lot of evidence that suggests something a very special friendship. It fits a lot of patterns, but it is interesting to note that after he came back from visiting Moscow in 1987, he took out ads, anti-NATO ads in 1987. I guess rich people do things with their money, and he's, presumably by then he was done going after the Central Park 5, right? And so that's later. Oh, well, I guess he was testing out that strategy. So he has money, or allegedly has money. He can spend it however he wants. So, there's, but I think, as I said earlier, in the end of the day, at this point, it doesn't matter so much whether he is an actual agent, right? The fact remains, when we look at his actions, he is acting like one, right? He may not be, but
he's not acting like an agent. He's acting in ways that might be quite contrary to U.S. interests.
Okay,
I'm
he,
acting like
the
an
president of
idiot.
the United
Claim.
States,
I wanna
right.
be very clear about
That's
that.
fine. The
very
president
strong.
of the United States is acting in the best interests of Russia and not in the best interests of the United States, but it is possible he's doing it for reasons other than being an agent of Russia.
It is fully possible for a U.S. leader to sympathize with Russia. I don't sympathize with Russia, but just because we have a leader who currently agrees with Russia does not make that leader treasonous.
A leader that
can agree and
prioritizes
disagree.
Russia over the United States.
Well, that's their.
And there's a difference between sympathizing and literally promoting Russian foreign policy, both domestically and internationally. Literally, Russian talking points are now part of the official U.S. behavior and actions. Again, whether it's a coincidence or not, I'm open to the possibility that it's a coincidence. But again, to me, at this point, eventually, I hope we'll find out one way or the other. But at this point, what matters more is that it's that is the reality.
I guess it's unusual for what I've ever seen from a president in my lifetime.
He's
So I
unusual
like
in
to
almost
hear
every
both.
way from every
Right.
president we've ever had. So yeah.
I appreciate your answers. Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
but
Nice
yeah.
to see right there.
Are we?
Oh my
I
God!
have
Well,
to
Dr.
teach
Toole
in
has a
5
class.
minutes, so I probably should head out pretty soon.
Um,
I just realized that for those who
Okay.
are my class in 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you very much.
and we did disagree genuinely. So anyway,
We didn't have to manufacture.
nope, we did not.